Okay, welcome everybody to the Applied Economics Faculty Lecture Series. My name is Frank Weiss, as you probably know. I'm the Program Director. We're very fortunate, first of all, to have so many guests with so much wind out. We're doubly fortunate to have Bilal Zia speak to us this evening on applying behavioral insights to public policy. Bilal is an economist in the Finance and Private Sector Development Research Group of the World Bank. His research is focused on the behavior of firms, banks, households, and their financial interactions using both experimental and non-experimental methods. His work has appeared in academic journals such as the Journal of Finance, the Journal of Financial Economics, and the Review of Financial Studies. Some of his recent work includes impact evaluations of financial and business literacy programs. I could use a financial literacy program for my own personal benefit. Debiasing financial and behavioral biases, network effects in small and medium enterprises, and optimal contract structure of microfinance loans. But aside from his academic work, he has operational experience with the bank in Africa, Latin America, Indonesia, and China, mostly in finance and financial education. He earned his PhD in economics from MIT, and he has a Bachelor of Science with honors from the London School of Economics. He teaches our Microeconomics of Development course here. Bilal, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Frank. Well, thanks everyone for coming and braving the winds and not flying away. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about sort of applying behavioral insights to public policy. So just before I turn the slides, just wanted to give you a very brief understanding, or my understanding of what behavioral economics is. So when I was in grad school more than a decade ago, behavioral economics was the application of insights from psychology and sort of the marriage of that with economics. Most of it was highly theoretical. So we just studied models and a lot of math and very little application. But with the advent of field experiments, impact evaluation has taken off rapidly over the last 10 years. With it has come the need for a greater understanding of how humans actually make decisions. How do we make economic decisions? And it turns out that we often make decisions that that one can label in economic terms as mistakes. So that's sort of where behavioral economics and insights from psychology can help tag what those mistakes are and how can we go about designing policy to correct them. So all of this has gained a lot of interest in both policy and academic circles within the World Bank, which is where I work during the day. And by the way, thank you. I see a lot of my former students here, so thanks everyone for coming. So I teach here at SAIS as well as for Frank in his program. So I am here almost throughout the year, basically. This is not working. Hold on. Here we go. So this interest in behavioral economics culminated at the World Bank with the World Development Report in 2015. So the World Development Report, for those of you who don't know, among the many fancy reports that the World Bank produces, this is by and far the largest one. It has the largest audience. There's an entire team dedicated to producing it. So in 2015, basically the entire report was based on behavioral economics. We called it Mind, Society, and Behavior, and I was part of the team that produced this. And since then, there has been continued interest in behavioral economics within the bank and also in academia and in public policy circles. So if you sort of press me on summarizing what the WDR or the World Development Report says in one slide, essentially the take-home message is that development policy is ready for a redesign based on a more realistic understanding of how humans think, how they behave, and how they make economic decisions. So to understand what this means, let's do a quick economics 101 review. So what is the standard approach to public policy? So what's the role of the policymaker, the way that we sort of learn about it in textbooks? So the policymaker is supposed to set up institutions and facilitate markets, provide the necessary resources, create rules of the game, laws, et cetera, and then affect prices through taxes and subsidies, fiscal policy, monetary policy, et cetera. And then step back and let people navigate their own decisions, right? So this is the role of the policymaker as standard theory would predict. Standard theory has also strong predictions on how humans actually do make these decisions when they're asked to. So we all maximize a utility function subject to some constraints. We optimally allocate time to its best use. We optimally spend resources and effort where reward is maximized. Right? So this is the standard neoclassical economics. This is a very powerful approach. In many cases, it's very applicable, but to some extent, it's also incomplete. If you think about it, do we actually make decisions where we're optimizing our time to its best sort of output that we can get out of time? So for those of you, for example, all of you are students here, have worked on assignments that have deadlines. How many of you have actually spent the majority of the time the night before the assignment is due, rather than allocating equal amount of time from the time that it was assigned to the time it was due, right? So if you're spending more time the night before it's due, then you're making a suboptimal decision. That's not what a utility maximizer would do. So that's just one example. But let's understand these decisions or the types of mistakes that we can make through a couple of metaphors. So the first metaphor I want to use is an airline pilot. So an airline pilot, this is a very high stakes environment, right? So there's lots happening very quickly. The stakes are very high. Mistakes can lead to very real consequences. There's a lot of information being presented in front of the pilot in real time, and he or she has to make decisions very, very quickly. So this is what a cockpit inside a commercial airliner looked like in the 1960s. So there's basically a lot of information being displayed. Each piece of information, such as like the angle of approach, the speed, whether the flaps are on or not, has its own dial. And basically and the pilot has to decide how to use this information and make decisions about what speed to run the aircraft, when to open the flaps, the angle of approach, etc. All these decisions that are fairly high stakes because mistakes can lead to very negative consequences. And with this model of information and decision-making context, a lot of mistakes were made, and a lot of airline crashes happened. As a result of this, the airline industry went back, did some homework, and decided to streamline the cockpit. So this is what a cockpit looks like now, right? So it's much more streamlined. Information is displayed where more pertinent information is displayed more upfront in some ways. There are sort of alarms that go off if you're not doing something correctly. There's also automation. You even have completely automated cockpits where the computer can basically fly the plane or assist you in flying the plane, assist you in landing, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this was done to avoid mistakes that are made in a high stakes environment, right? So if you think about public policy, if you think about poverty, especially since I'm a development economist, that's sort of the context in which my work is focused on. Poverty is also a high stakes environment where people face multiple, often unpredictable constraints, just like a pilot does. Like things can happen suddenly, unexpectedly. What happens when such shocks hit? People also have multiple, often unpredictable resources. So poor people in poor countries typically don't have a steady income stream. Think about a farmer who has a harvest. So when the harvest hits, there's a huge positive income shock, but outside of those times, he or she doesn't have a lot of income. Maybe if it doesn't rain enough, then that sort of source of income also dries up. So there's a lot of uncertainty around the income source. So this is also a high stakes environment with high potential for mistakes. So another analogy I want to use is that we tend to make mistakes when we think about things because thinking is difficult. So let me give you another example. So this is an example that other people have also used who are focused in the area of behavioral economics. So this is basically a visual illusion. So these are two tables, right? So the table, you're asked to basically compare the length of the table on the left to the width of the table on the right. So which one is actually longer? So, or which is the table on the left longer, or is the table on the right wider? What do you guys think? So can anyone think or see this picture and say that the table on the left is not longer, right? Everybody agrees that the table on the left is longer. However, if I can do some arts and crafts and run some animation and show you that in fact they're exactly the same length. So this is basically an example of where your mind and your eyes are deceiving you. And what's surprising about this is that if I take this animation away, it's as if you haven't learned anything in the last second, right? Because as soon as I take this animation away, the illusion reappears in your mind and you still think that the one on the left is longer than the one on the right, right? So the idea is that humans tend to make mistakes. And in this visual illusion, we are making mistakes with our vision. Vision is something that we do really, really well. There's a large part of the human brain that is dedicated to vision. There's an evolutionary reason for good vision. Obviously, when we were hunters and gatherers, we had to run away from things that would eat us, and we needed to see them, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a reason for having really good vision. And obviously, we spend a lot of time practicing vision. We wake up, and by the time we go to sleep, every second of the day, we're using vision. So it's something that we practice a lot. And if we can make mistakes in vision that we are very good at, imagine how many mistakes we can make in things that we are not so good at, like financial decision making, right? So circling back to this idea of what development policy used to be, or how development policymakers used to think about development policy, was that humans make decisions deliberately, deliberatively, independently, on the basis of consistent and self-interested preferences. So what's now evolving with the advent of behavioral economics is that that's not the case. People, in fact, have a tendency of thinking automatically. When making decisions, we usually draw on what comes to mind effortlessly and easily. So where less thinking is involved, those are the types of decisions that we like to make. We like to spend less time thinking. We also think socially. Social norms guide much of our behavior, and we're essentially conditional cooperators. And finally, we think with mental models. When we perceive what we perceive and how others interpret us and our decisions depends on our view of the world, how we think that the world exists. So I'm going to explain each of these in a little bit more detail. So when we think automatically, it's basically we're having a partial view of the world. So we're looking at the world outside the window that's right in front of us, essentially. So this is our window. But in fact, the real world might actually be much larger. So if we only see trees, we might think that that's basically all of the world, but the world might have lakes, it might have mountains, it might have clouds. In fact, the world might have many other things that we don't even see. So when we think automatically, we only think about things that are within our window of sight, and that's basically our decision frame. And we're not taking into account what's outside our decision frame. So here's an example of thinking automatically. So this is where you guys have to actually participate. So this is a game. So the game is that you have to add 3 to the following number. So I'm going to put up a series of numbers. So this is 4, 3, 5, 1. So your job is to add 3 to each digit. So 4 plus 3 is 7. So it becomes 7. 3 becomes 6. 5 becomes 8. 1 becomes 4, right? So it's 7, 6, 8, 4. Now, if basically you get 2 digits, if I have 9, for example, 9 plus 3 is 12. So you're just going to keep 2, right? So you keep the second digit. All right, so all of you now join me in solving this next problem. So it's 9, 2, 7, 4. So what is this going to become? Okay, so this is 2, 5, 0, 7. All right, let's do one more, and maybe you guys can be a little bit louder. I mean, this is basic math you learned in 3rd grade, so I'm sure you can do this. Right, so this is 2, 8, 1, 9. So what will this become? Add 3 to each number. Okay, 5, 1, 4, 2. Great. I think half of you got it right. Okay, so the point of this is that if you were actually like a respondent in Daniel Kahneman's lab experiments, what has just happened in the last 2 minutes is that your heart rate has increased by 7 beats per minute. Your pupils have dilated by 50%, and your blood pressure has gone up, just because you had to think, right? So the idea is that thinking hard takes biological energy. Even without you thinking, even without you noticing, your body is responding to you making an effort by sort of metrics that we can measure biologically. So it's an effort that's imposed on the body when you have to think, and it's hard. This often leads to mistakes, and some of the mistakes that we have identified through sort of various researchers have identified are things like procrastination, which is basically putting off difficult decisions to later. For example, you might have noticed how you put off difficult assignments to later, where you just want to watch Netflix for the moment and you'll come back to the assignment later. You're procrastinating. There's time inconsistency, which is a related concept. There's limited attention. There's adherence to defaults. There's anchoring based off the type of information that we are presented, etc. So let me give you another example of automatic thinking. So this is also from another lab experiment from a renowned behavioral economist. So basically, this is the equation that you guys have to solve. 1 multiplied by 2 all the way to 8. So without a calculator, what's your best guess? What is the answer of this? Right? Okay, well, this is more than 3rd grade math, so I'll forgive you for not answering this correctly. But the median answer for this problem is 512. Okay, so now think about that for a second, and maybe you can cheat with your calculator, and you realize that this is very low. Right? The real answer is actually much higher than 512. But what's even more interesting is that if I divided you up randomly into 2 groups, and for the first group I showed 1 multiplied by 2 all the way to the 8, your median answer will be 512. And for the other group, if I presented the same problem only in reverse, the median answer is much higher. And the only thing different is the way that I've presented this information. So what you're doing actually is you're anchoring on the initial numbers that you see. So you start with 1 multiplied by 2. When 1 and 2 are really low numbers, I'm going to sort of undershoot what I'm going to guess as the estimate. Whereas in the second way of presenting the same problem, the first 3 numbers are 8 multiplied by 7 multiplied by 6. These are larger numbers, so I should upgrade my guess, which is why the median answer is higher. And for those of you who are math majors here and are sort of itching to get out of your chair and scream, you're absolutely right. Neither of these are correct answers. The correct answer of this problem is 40,320, right? So neither of those 2 groups were correct. But the idea is that framing actually matters, and we basically automatically assign value or weights to the way the information is presented, even though the information is exactly the same. So in terms of real world, this is a very famous paper from Johnson Goldstein from 1998. Essentially, this graph, you might have already seen this in elsewhere, but this is basically the rate of organ organ donation. So when you go to the DMV or when you go get your driver's license, right? So you can sign up to become an organ donor, right? So if you get into an accident and you pass away, your organs can be donated to science or to somebody else who might need them. So this is basically the rate of organ donation. So you can see the countries on the right, the blue bars, they have a very, very high rate of organ donation, almost 100%. And the countries on the left have very, very low rates of organ donation, right? So the first thought you might have is, well, maybe these countries are just different. There's something about culture, there's something about the way that people think about other people, something about social norms that's driving this. But if you look at this carefully, we have countries like Austria on the right with 99.98% people who have signed up to be organ donors, and Germany, which by all accounts is a fairly similar country in terms of social norms and culture, is to the left with only 12%. Denmark is all the way to the left with 4%, and Sweden, which is another Nordic country, is all the way to the right at 86%. Similarly, Netherlands is on the left and Belgium is on the right. So these countries are very, very similar in terms of their culture, in terms of people, but they have very contrasting views on organ donation. So what is going on? What's going on is essentially the way that the person at the DMV, the way that he or she designed the form. So for the people on the right, the DMV form says, check here if you do not want to be an organ donor. Nobody checks anything, and you are by default enrolled as an organ donor. For the countries on the left, the form is slightly different. The form says, check here if you want to be an organ donor. And by default, nobody checks anything, and they don't enroll in the organ donor program. So essentially, think about this for a second. Our automatic thinking basically ensures that we don't read any of the fine print. Like, how many of you actually read the fine print when you sign up for something online? Like, you buy something on, or you sign up for a new credit card or a new bank account, and they give you 14 pages of fine print. Please read this and sign at the bottom. How many of you actually read it? No, you just scroll all the way to the bottom, you click I agree, and you sign, right? So you have no idea the person who's designing that can put whatever they want in that fine print. And this is basically things like opt-in and opt-out, which is this is an example of, where the countries on with the blue bars have an opt-out that by default you're enrolled. And if you don't want it, you can opt out. And versus countries on the left where by default you opt in, you're not enrolled, but you can opt in. So these insights have been used for public policy. For example, automatically enrolling people into retirement savings accounts. So X% of your monthly wages will go directly into your 401k account. If you want to change it, you can. It turns out that 85% of the people don't do anything. They just allow their money to go into the retirement account. However, if the policy was in reverse, that you have the option to enroll into the 401k and put X% into your retirement account, nobody actually takes the step to enroll into the account. So basically, it's in the hands of the person designing the policy, where they have just switched the way that the policy is designed. Nothing else is different. The underlying economics is exactly the same. You're still putting exactly the same amount of money away for savings. The only thing is, you were just too lazy to do it yourself, but somebody else did it for you through this automatic enrollment. Similarly, automatically depositing cash transfers into savings accounts. So cash transfers have become a very popular topic in development economics. both conditional cash transfers and unconditional cash transfers. Well, where do these cash transfers go once they hit the recipient? Well, that's where basically you can automatically route them to a savings account. And it turns out that that has positive impacts on how the money is spent and ultimate welfare. So another topic that's closely linked to automatic thinking is willpower. So we've seen through a couple of metaphors and a couple of examples that cognition is difficult. It takes energy. So does willpower. So let me give you an example of what I mean by willpower. So this is an example of time inconsistency. So this is a picture of basically a data entry firm in India. And these workers here, their job is to basically enter data into a computer. So think about like survey data that they have to put into electronic form, et cetera, et cetera. So they have targets that every day or every week they have to enter X amount of entry. They have to make X amount of entries, right? Now, if these people were perfectly rational neoclassical decision makers, the type of contract you provide them in terms of remuneration shouldn't matter in terms of like, if we provide them with for example, a commitment contract. By that I mean that if you do not hit a target of X entries per week, then your pay will be cut by 20%, right? So if they were neoclassical decision makers, offering them this contract shouldn't matter at all, right? Because why would they need a commitment device or sort of a stick at the end of the week in order for them to exert effort today? The problem is exerting effort today is difficult. You rather exert effort tomorrow. But when tomorrow arrives, you're faced with the same decision. You again put off effort to the next tomorrow because exerting effort today is difficult, right? So think about your assignments. Like you wake up this morning and said, gosh, I have to work on this problem set on propensity score matching. This is for all my students from SAIS. And you're like, no, this is too difficult. I'll do it tomorrow because I still have 4 days to work on it, right? So eventually the last day arrives and that's when you have to put in all the effort and have a huge negative impact on your daily life, right? So it turns out that when these workers were offered this commitment contract, they signed up for it. And it turns out that it worked, that they committed to making X% entries per week or X entries per week. And if they didn't hit that target, that their pay was deducted by 20%. So this is an example of where basically the design of contracts can play a huge role in how effort is exerted and the ultimate outcome. So it turns out that by designing this type of contract, their wages remained constant over several months, which led to welfare gains in their household because they didn't have income fluctuations, et cetera, et cetera. So the lesson for public policy here is that, well, if we can do this for workers in data entry in India, well, why can't we do this for other contexts? So one context where it has been tried and has worked fairly well is for savings. So just commitment savings products. Think of these as lockboxes. So you have to put money into a lockbox, but you can't access it for 6 months. So you keep putting money in, it's locked away. It's basically tying your hands. You can't touch it. But after 6 months, you can take out the lump sum, essentially. And this has been shown to improve not only the amount of savings, but also household welfare outcomes, right? Similarly, other researchers have shown how health emergency lockboxes can increase savings by up to 70%. So this is an example of basically mental account. So what is a mental account? A mental account is basically an artificial separation of money. So if you think about money is fungible, right? So I can give you $1, you can spend $1 on buying a packet of crisps, or you can spend $1 to buy a pencil for your homework, or you could do whatever you want with the dollar. Money is fungible. A mental account is that this is $1 that is dedicated to buying pencil, right? So, and it's somehow different than another dollar that I'm going to use to buy crisps. So that's sort of a mental account that many of us have. Like a lot of us might be saving for a new iGadget, for example, and we're just putting money away into a separate account, saving up for that. And somehow that motivates us. Somehow we look at that and say, okay, I'm only 20% short. I can add more money, and eventually I can buy this fancy iDevice I want. But it turns out all of that is in your head, right? Money is always fungible. It doesn't matter. You don't have to label that account as an iDevice account, right? You can label it whatever you want. But somehow we have these mental accounts that facilitate the way we make decisions, and that tends to help. So this was an example where this account was labeled as an account for your health, for saving towards sort of vaccinating your children, or paying for hospital fees when they get sick, et cetera, and it had pretty large impacts. So the second concept I want to talk about is the fact that we think socially. So what I mean by that is that we are social animals. So we observe what other people are doing, how they're making decisions, and what their view of the world is. And that somehow, even if their window into the world is different from ours, we look at what they're doing, we observe their actions, and somehow that influences what we do. Right? So we are not making decisions in a vacuum. We're always making decisions based on what other people are doing around us. So the coolest example, or actually there are a couple of cool examples. So this is an example of where when you get your electricity bill, so this is the bill that Pepco sends us, right? So what they're sending us is not just what your electricity consumption is, but they're comparing your electricity consumption to others, right? So they're saying your home is using this many kilowatt hours. This is what efficient, similar homes like yours are using, and this is what other homes are using in your neighborhood. So this is by neighborhood. And then they have these smiley faces, whether if you're doing better than others, then you're doing great. And if you're doing worse, then they might even have frowns. So this is my electricity bill. Obviously, I'm doing great. And also for the parents in this room, which might not be many, you can also actually use this to assess when your children go to sleep, right? Because you can see at the bottom that on average, most electricity is used from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. So I know that my daughter is sleeping at 11 p.m. rather than staying up all night. So, although she never tells me, so now I can look at the electricity bill and know when she's going to sleep. So, good tip. Here's another example. So this is an example from Colombia. In the 1990s, Colombia in Bogota, the capital, faced a water crisis. So one of the dams, it was called the San Rafael Dam. It had some problems, and suddenly there was a huge water shortage. So the mayor of Bogota was this very sort of charismatic, forward-looking guy, and he decided that he wanted to encourage people to save water, right? So and he had all kinds of different campaigns. He had this essentially picture of the namesake of the dam, who's a saint, and basically printed out newspaper articles highlighting how much the damage that has been done, how much water is left, how much is being used every day, and how much savings you can make, and what influence that would have, just to sort of motivate people to save more water, and other things like giving people awards and if for saving water. And these awards weren't grandiose, sort of big monetary value awards. For example, this one is simply a poster for being a good saver for the week or for the month during this emergency in this particular case, right? And then there are other examples where basically relating what people have used, the types of things that people have used to save water. So this is basically how they've saved. So my favorite is this guy Alejandro Gomez on the right, who basically let's see if this works. No, it doesn't work. Yeah. So basically, he's saying here basically that he washes his clothes only on the weekends, which might have other negative consequences, but that's okay. But the best part was basically that he likes to take showers with his partner, right? So this can have other positive impacts on your life, if you know what I mean. So the idea was that these types of interventions, which basically weren't charging people more money, it was just presenting the same pitch or the same information in a different way. It's just motivating people to take action through different channels rather than simply providing information, right? It turned out it had a big effect. So this is basically water consumption in the 90s all the way up to 2009, and you can see that the impact lasted well beyond the water crisis, which was around here, and then only later that it started going up. So it had huge impacts on how people thought about saving for water. So we are influenced by what other people think and what other people do. We also think with mental models. So basically, our mental model of the way of viewing the world is limited to what we see, and other people's mental models might be limited to what they see. So and what this also means is that there's room for influencing these mental models or these decision-making contexts. So let me give you an example from Brazil. So fertility used to be a pretty big problem, and fertility rates were fairly high. It was problematic in Brazil, but suddenly in the 1970s on, the fertility rate started to go down pretty dramatically. And nowadays in Brazil, the fertility rate is sort of comparable to developed countries. So what actually happened here is that the government itself did not have any particular directive or program towards sort of, for example, promoting contraception or motivating people to have less children. What actually happened was that television, which is pervasive, not just in Brazil, but elsewhere as well, and is sort of a huge way that informs how we make our decisions and informs us on the views of the world and what the worldview of everyone else is a very strong medium, right? So essentially, there's a research paper that looks at the largest cable provider, channel provider in Brazil that used to run these telenovelas, very soap operas, essentially, right? And it turns out that starting in the 70s, about 80, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think it was about 80% of the lead female actresses in their telenovelas started appearing with only one child or no child at all. So slowly, through osmosis, the way that this information was being presented as having a small family or having no children at all started to penetrate the way that people make decisions. So there's a really nice research paper by actually a fellow researcher at the World Bank that looks at basically the penetration of this cable provider across different regions in Brazil. And they show that in places where this cable provider was available, the fertility rates in those regions went down faster than in other regions, which basically gives us some insight into causality, that this is how people are changing their decisions. I have done some work myself in this area using the soap operas basically to change how people make financial decisions, and this was done in South Africa, where we embedded decisions about, or the way that people make financial decisions about things like gambling or hire purchase credit, which in South Africa is not regulated, unlike the US. So for example, here, if you go buy a television at Best Buy and you take out the Best Buy credit, it's the same as if you buy it on your Visa or MasterCard. However, in South Africa, it's different. If you go to the equivalent of Best Buy in South Africa and they sell you their credit program, their interest rates are exorbitant. It's not regulated. So they could charge you as much as a moneylender. And they do. So what we tried to do through the soap opera was basically build a storyline where the main character actually goes through these troubles, ends up in huge amounts of debt, and eventually works their way out of it. And it turns out that despite the numerous financial education programs that have been evaluated through fairly rigorously, none of them, or the majority of them, don't really find impacts on financial behavior, that people are changing the way that they make decisions. This did. So this was one of the first studies where we showed, through an RCT actually, through a randomized controlled trial, that providing information through this medium, which is television, had a huge impact on how people made decisions. So again, going to this idea of how mental models affect our decision making. So finally, I want to turn, in the remaining time, I go till when?
As long as you like.
Oh, okay.
It's interesting.
Okay. I guess one application of all these insights is to think about poverty slightly differently. Rather than thinking about poverty as a constant, or rather as a given, think about poverty as a decision-making context. And what I mean by that is that for the same person, that context might change over time. So here's an example of a sugarcane farmer in India. As I mentioned slightly or a little while ago, that for this farmer, at the time of harvest is a huge income shock, right? Huge positive income shock. So right before the harvest, he is very poor, and right after the harvest, he's very rich. So there's a huge difference in the decision environment that he faces around the harvest. And it's been shown through several studies that if you actually quantify this by looking at things like percentage of things that they had to sell from the house or pawn in order to survive, before is very large amounts and after is very small. A percentage of people who had to take out loans is very high before and very small afterwards. And what's important here is that as these decision-making contexts change, so does the cognitive cost. So here's a basically standard executive function test that the researchers who did this study performed on these farmers, both before and after the harvest. So this is called a Stroop Test. Basically, you have to first state the color of each word. So the first line is very easy, red, blue, green. Now, I won't embarrass you guys, so you don't actually have to read the second line. But essentially, the idea of the second line is that you have to state the color of each word, right? So this is where it gets confusing. You might immediately say red, but the correct answer is green, because the color of the first word is green, not red. But immediately you want to say red, right? So this is a test of executive function. It turns out that right before the harvest, if you compare before and after the harvest, your IQ goes up by 10 points after the harvest. And this is not just limited to a poor farmer in India. There are people who've done this right here in the US, where they brought people to a lab and they primed people slightly differently. So for one group, they said, think about your car, and imagine that you have to suddenly something happens to your car and you have to make a $200 payment. Think about where you would come up with those funds, right? So this was one group. For the other group, they posed the same problem, but they changed the amount of money that they would have to spend. So they said, imagine something happened to your car and you would have to spend $2,000 to fix it. So basically, and then later on in the game, they did an executive function test, and it turns out that people who were provided with the harder problem, which basically made them stressed out a bit, scored 10 points lower in IQ than people who were less stressed out. So just giving you an insight that decision-making contexts can change, and they are actually fungible. They're not fixed. So all of these insights essentially lead us to what what we're trying to do, and many other researchers are trying to do in operationalizing social and behavioral insights, which is to test them and retest them and basically keep regenerating new ideas and new insights into products that work for everyone. So here's an example of one that for any of my master's students, not SAIS, but from Frank's program, this is one of the case studies that we do in class, is basically clean water supply, basically. So basically, in many poor villages in Africa and other poor countries, people collect water from the ground. It's contaminated. That leads to health problems like diarrhea. Diarrhea is a really big problem, especially for infants, and can actually lead to death. So one way to fix this problem is to basically create these wells. So you basically cement the source. You can't contaminate. The water is not contaminated at the source. Nobody's putting buckets into the mud. The water comes out through these pipes. It's clean. They can take water home and have clean water. Turns out that people were still getting sick. And after this program, they realized that the containers that they were using were dirty. So while they put clean water in the containers, the time that it took for them to take it home, the container contaminated the water. So they still had the same disease profile as before. So the next solution that they thought of was, well, why don't we provide chlorine patches, or just provide chlorine to people and give people vouchers to go get chlorine from the local market, right? And that once they add chlorine, then they can purify the water that they get in their containers. It turns out this didn't work either, because people really forgot. They forgot to put the chlorine in, and they didn't want to walk all the way to the market to get the chlorine patches. So ultimately, what they tried through rigorous testing was a very simple solution. They put a chlorine dispenser right at the source of the water, right? So here's the water that's coming out of these pipes. Right next to them is this highly visible chlorine dispenser. So you put water in your container, you immediately put chlorine in it. Other people observe you doing it. They learn socially. There's herd behavior. So other people are also going to do the same thing. And it turns out the disease profile goes down substantially. So just the way that the intervention was provided can have huge impacts on what the take-up rates are and what the ultimate impacts are on, in this case, health profiles. So the main lesson is to embed and diagnose and experiment so that implementation can improve. So finally, I just want to conclude by going back to where I started with this metaphor. So the airline industry started off here, where the decision-making environment was very difficult. They faced severe consequences as a result, and immediately they changed the decision environment. They made it more streamlined. They made it easier for the pilots to make decisions. It automated a lot of things. It made it less likely that pilots would make mistakes. So what policymakers can do, and what we're advocating for them to do, is that for them to understand that poverty and development policy are also high-stakes environments, high-stakes situations, and it's incumbent upon us to also redesign, just the way that airline industry redesigned the cockpit, is for us to redesign the choice environment, redesign how people are presented with information, how they're presented with decisions, to help them make better decisions for their own interests. That's it. Thank you.